Have you ever wondered how a very small idea can slowly change an entire neighborhood? What if a single shelf of old books could bring strangers together? What if one quiet morning decision could turn into something that touches hundreds of lives? Sometimes, the most meaningful changes do not begin with big plans. They begin with a simple thought, a quiet moment, and a person who decides to do something kind. This story begins with a man named Mr. Harold Bennett. Mr. Bennett was 72 years old when he finally retired from teaching. For more than 40 years, he had worked as a history teacher at a small public school. Every morning, he woke up early, made a cup of black coffee, and prepared lessons for his students. He loved teaching. He loved the sound of young voices in the classroom. He loved the moment when the student suddenly understood something new. But time moves quietly, and one day his final school year arrived. On the last day of class, his students surprised him. They decorated the classroom with handmade cards. Some students wrote long letters thanking him for helping them believe in themselves. Others simply wrote two small words, "Thank you." Mr. Bennett tried to smile as he read the letters, but his eyes filled with tears. When the school bell rang for the final time, the hallway slowly emptied. For the first time in 40 years, Mr. Bennett walked out of the school building, knowing he would not return the next morning. Retirement sounded peaceful in theory, but the first few weeks felt strangely quiet. Every morning, Mr. Bennett still woke up at 6. His body was used to the rhythm of a teacher's life. He made coffee, he sat by the window, and he listened to the silence in his small house. At first, he thought the silence was relaxing, but after a few weeks, it began to feel lonely. One afternoon, while cleaning his study room, Mr. Bennett noticed something he had ignored for years. Books. Books everywhere. There were tall shelves filled with history books, novels, biographies, and old textbooks. Some books were so old that their pages had turned yellow. Many of them had been gifts from students. Others were books he had used while preparing lessons. He slowly picked up one of the novels. Inside the cover was a small message written by a student from many years ago. "Thank you for showing me that books can change how we see the world, Mister." Bennett sat down in his chair and held the book in his hands for a long time. That evening, he walked outside to take a short walk around his neighborhood. The neighborhood was quiet and ordinary. Small houses stood close together. Children sometimes rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Neighbors waved politely, but rarely stopped to talk. As he walked, Mr. Bennett noticed something else. The small public library at the end of the street had closed months ago. A sign on the door explained that the building needed repairs and funding. Without the library, many children in the neighborhood had nowhere nearby to borrow books. Mr. Bennett stood in front of the locked library doors for several minutes. Then a thought quietly entered his mind. It was not a big plan. It was only a small idea. But sometimes small ideas are the most powerful ones. What if people could still borrow books? He whispered to himself. The next morning, Mr. Bennett returned to his study room. He looked again at the tall shelves filled with books. There were far more books than he could ever read again. He carefully selected a few of them. Then he placed them in a small cardboard box. Later that afternoon, he carried the box outside and sat on the front steps of his house. He stared at the empty space near his front gate. An idea was slowly growing in his mind. A very simple idea. A small wooden shelf, a few books, and a sign. He smiled quietly. The following weekend, Mr. Bennett visited a hardware store. He bought a few pieces of wood, some nails, and a small can of paint. The young cashier asked him what he was building. "Mister." Bennett thought for a moment. Then he answered with a gentle smile, "A tiny library?" The cashier laughed politely, not fully understanding what he meant, but Mr. Bennet knew exactly what he wanted to create. Back at home, he spent the afternoon in his garage. His hands were a little slower than they used to be, but he worked carefully. He measured the wood. He hammered the nails. Little by little, a small wooden box with shelves began to take shape. It was not perfect. One side leaned slightly. The paint was not completely smooth. But when he finished, Mr. Bennet stepped back and looked at his work with quiet satisfaction. It was simple, but it was exactly what he imagined. The next day, he placed the small wooden shelf near the sidewalk in front of his house. He filled it with 10 books. Some were children's stories, and some were novels. Some were history books that he thought curious readers might enjoy. Then he added a small handwritten sign. "Free books. Take one, leave one if you can." Mr. Bennet stood there for a moment, looking at the tiny library. The street was quiet. Cars passed occasionally. A dog barked in the distance. For a few minutes, nothing happened. But Mr. Bennet did not mind. He returned inside his house, made another cup of coffee, and sat by the window. From there, he could see the small shelf near the sidewalk. An hour passed. Then something interesting happened. A young boy riding a bicycle slowed down near the shelf. He stopped. He looked around. Then he walked closer and examined the books. Mr. Bennet watched quietly from behind the curtain. The boy picked up a book. He turned the pages slowly. Then he smiled. After a moment of hesitation, the boy placed the book in his backpack. He looked around once more, almost as if he was worried someone might stop him. But the street remained calm. Finally, he rode away. Mr. Bennet leaned back in his chair. A warm feeling spread through his chest. One book had found a new reader. It was a small beginning, but every story begins somewhere. By the end of the afternoon, 2 more books had disappeared from the shelf. Mr. Bennet did not know who took them, but he imagined people reading them somewhere in the neighborhood. Later that evening, as the sun slowly disappeared behind the houses, Mr. Bennet walked outside again. Something surprising was waiting for him. On the shelf next to the remaining books, someone had placed a new one. It was a children's storybook. No name. No note. Just a book quietly added to the collection. Mr. Bennet gently picked it up and turned the first page. Inside was a small message written in blue ink. "For the next reader." Mr. Bennet smiled softly. He placed the book back on the shelf. Then he sat on the front steps and watched the quiet street. He did not know it yet, but the tiny shelf in front of his house was about to change far more than he could imagine. Because sometimes the smallest libraries can open the biggest doors. And sometimes the quietest ideas can bring a whole neighborhood together. The next morning, Mr. Bennet woke up earlier than usual. It was still quiet outside. Soft morning light slipped slowly through the curtains, painting pale lines across the wooden floor. For a moment, he simply lay in bed and listened. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began singing. A car engine started down the street. The neighborhood was slowly waking up. Mr. Bennet sat up and rubbed his eyes gently. Then he remembered the small wooden shelf outside, the tiny library. He smiled to himself. After making his usual cup of coffee, he walked toward the front window again. From there, he could clearly see the shelf near the sidewalk. For a moment, he just stared quietly. 3 books were gone from yesterday, and 1 new book had appeared. But something else surprised him. 2 children were standing near the shelf. They looked about 8 or 9 years old. One of them was holding a red backpack. The other was pointing excitedly at the books. Mr. Bennet stayed behind the curtain, careful not to interrupt their moment. The boy with the backpack picked up a book and opened it. The two children leaned close together, reading the first page. They laughed quietly. Then the second child chose another book and flipped through the pages. After a short discussion, they placed one book back and kept the other. Before leaving, one of them carefully adjusted the books so they stood neatly on the shelf. Then they walked away toward the corner of the street. Mr. Bennet felt a warm sense of happiness inside his chest. It was such a small thing, but it felt meaningful. Books were moving, stories were traveling, readers were appearing. Later that afternoon, Mr. Bennet decided to check the shelf more closely. When he stepped outside, he noticed something new again. Another book had been added. This one looked older. Its cover was worn, and the edges of the pages were slightly bent. But inside the cover, and someone had written a short message. "Stories are better when they are shared." Mr. Bennet gently ran his fingers across the words. He wondered who had left it. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a parent, maybe someone who simply liked the idea of the tiny library. Over the next few days, the small shelf began to attract quiet attention. People slowed down when they walked past. Some stopped for only a few seconds. Others stood longer, reading the titles carefully. A woman walking her dog paused one evening and selected a small novel. The next morning, a teenager left a science fiction book on the shelf before catching the school bus. Mr. Bennet watched these small moments from his window. Each time someone approached the shelf, he felt the same quiet excitement. It was like watching a garden slowly grow. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. Mr. Bennet heard a knock on his door. He opened it slowly. Standing on the porch was a young girl holding a book with both hands. She looked nervous but determined. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Yes?" Mr. Bennet replied with a gentle smile. "Are you the one who put the bookshelf outside?" Mr. Bennet nodded. "I am." The girl held up the book. "I borrowed this one yesterday." Mr. Bennet recognized it immediately. It was a simple adventure story for young readers. "Did you enjoy it?" he asked. The girl nodded quickly. "It was really good." She paused, then added shyly, "My little brother wants to read it too. Is that okay?" Mr. Bennet chuckled warmly. "Of course. Books are meant to travel." The girl smiled with relief. Then she pulled another book from her backpack. "I wanted to leave this one," she said. "My mom says it was her favorite when she was a kid." Mr. Bennet accepted the book gently. "Thank you," he said. "What's your name?" "Emily." "Well, Emily," Mr. Bennet said kindly, "you just helped the library grow." Emily looked surprised. "Library?" Mr. Bennet pointed toward the shelf. "It may be small," he said, "but it's still a library." Emily looked toward the street and smiled proudly. Before leaving, she turned back and asked one more question. "Can I tell my friends about it?" Mr. Bennet's smile grew even wider. "I hope you do." That evening, Mr. Bennet added 5 more books to the shelf. He wanted there to be enough for anyone who stopped by. But something interesting was already happening. The library was no longer only his. People were beginning to take part. The next weekend brought even more activity. A father walking with his young son stopped for several minutes to read a picture book together. 2 teenagers laughed while arguing about which mystery novel was better. Someone left a stack of magazines neatly tied with string. Another person placed a small notebook inside the shelf. On the first page was a simple invitation. "Write your name if you borrowed a book." Below the message, several names had already appeared. Mr. Bennet flipped through the pages slowly. Each name represented a reader. Each reader represented a story continuing somewhere in the neighborhood. For the first time since his retirement, Mr. Bennett felt something familiar again: purpose. When he had been a teacher, his job was to help people discover ideas, to help them explore the world through books. Now, in a quiet and unexpected way, he was doing the same thing again, just without a classroom, without a schedule, without a bell ringing at the end of the lesson. Instead, there was only a small wooden shelf, a quiet street, and a growing circle of curious readers. But Mr. Bennett still had no idea how far this tiny library would travel, because the real change was only beginning, and soon the entire neighborhood would start to notice. A week passed, then another. Slowly, the tiny library in front of Mr. Bennett's house became a quiet part of the neighborhood's daily life. At first, only a few people stopped by, but word travels in gentle ways. Children told their friends, parents mentioned it during conversations at the grocery store. Someone even posted a small photo of the wooden shelf on a local community page online. Soon, more people began walking past Mr. Bennett's house, curious to see the little library for themselves. Every morning, Mr. Bennett followed the same peaceful routine. He woke up early, he made his coffee, and he looked through the front window toward the shelf. Almost every day, something had changed. Sometimes a book disappeared, sometimes two new ones appeared. Once, someone left a beautiful hardcover novel that looked almost brand new. Another day, a collection of children's picture books arrived, stacked neatly like a colorful tower. The shelf was slowly filling with different voices and stories. Stories from different homes, stories from different lives. One cool afternoon, mister. Bennett decided to sit outside instead of watching from the window. He placed a small wooden chair near the porch and brought a book with him. It felt good to sit under the open sky. A gentle breeze moved through the trees along the street. A few dry leaves rolled across the sidewalk like tiny travelers. Before long, a boy on a skateboard slowed down near the shelf. He stepped off the board and began looking through the books. After a moment, he noticed Mr. Bennett sitting nearby. The boy looked slightly embarrassed. Is it really free?" he asked. Mr. Bennett smiled warmly. "Yes," he said. "Books like to be read." The boy picked up a mystery novel. "I don't have to bring it back?" "You can keep it for a while," Mr. Bennett replied calmly. "But if you finish it, maybe you'll pass it to someone else someday." The boy nodded thoughtfully. "That's kinda cool." Then he placed the book under his arm and rolled away on his skateboard. Mr. Bennett chuckled quietly. Later that same day, something else interesting happened. A woman in her 30s approached the shelf while pushing a baby stroller. She looked through the book slowly. Then she turned toward Mr. Bennett. "Are you the person who started this?" "I suppose I am," Mr. Bennett answered gently. The woman smiled. "My name is Laura. I live 2 streets away." She pointed at the shelf. "My daughter is still too young to read, but I think this is a wonderful idea." From the bottom of the stroller, she pulled out 3 children's books. "They belong to my older son," she explained. "He's grown up now, but these stories helped him fall asleep when he was little." She carefully placed the books on the shelf. Mr. Bennett felt a quiet warmth in his chest again. "Thank you," he said. Laura looked around the street. "You know," she added thoughtfully, "this neighborhood feels a little friendlier since this appeared." Mr. Bennett hadn't thought about it that way before, but as he looked around, he noticed something. People were slowing down. Neighbors were talking more. Children were stopping to read together. The shelf had quietly created a small meeting place, not a loud one, not a busy one, but a gentle gathering point. Over the next few days, Mr. Bennet began noticing familiar faces. The boy with the skateboard returned twice. Emily came back with her little brother, proudly showing him the books. A retired man from the corner house began leaving old travel magazines. One morning, someone even placed a small flower pot beside the shelf. Bright yellow flowers added a cheerful touch to the tiny library. Mr. Bennet watered them every evening. The shelf itself began to look different too. The books changed constantly. Some came, some went, but the collection was slowly growing. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with soft orange colors, Mr. Bennet walked outside to organize the books. While adjusting the rows, he noticed something tucked between two novels. It was a folded piece of paper. Curious, he opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten message. Dear library owner, I don't know your name, but I want to say thank you. My son has been reading more since this appeared. Before this, he spent most of his time on his phone. Now he asks to walk down the street just to check if new books arrived. I think you started something special. A grateful parent. Mr. Bennet read the letter twice. Then he folded it slowly and placed it in his pocket. For a long moment, he stood beside the shelf without moving. He had not planned any of this. He had only wanted to share a few books. But somehow, that small decision had begun touching other lives. It reminded him of something he used to tell his students many years ago. Small actions create big stories. As the sky slowly darkened, streetlights flickered on one by one. Mr. Bennet returned to his porch and sat quietly in his chair. Across the street, a young boy was already reading one of the books he had borrowed earlier. His mother sat nearby on the steps, yet watching him with a soft smile. Mr. Bennet leaned back and breathed deeply. For the first time since retiring, he no longer felt that strange emptiness in his days. Life had brought him a new classroom. A classroom without walls. A classroom without desks. Just a small wooden shelf filled with stories. And a neighborhood slowly discovering them. But soon something unexpected would happen. Something that would make the tiny library grow far beyond one simple shelf. The following Monday morning began like many other quiet mornings in Mr. Bennet's neighborhood. The air was cool and calm. Soft light from the rising sun slowly warmed the street. Birds rested on telephone wires, chirping gently as if greeting the new day. Inside his small house, Mr. Bennet followed his familiar routine. He woke up early. He brewed a cup of coffee, and as always, he walked to the window to look at the tiny library outside. But this morning, something unusual caught his attention immediately. There were more books than yesterday, many more. Mr. Bennet blinked in surprise. The shelf was nearly full, but beside it, sitting carefully on the ground, was a neat stack of additional books. He quickly put on his sweater and stepped outside. The morning air felt fresh against his face. As he approached the shelf, he noticed something else. A small handwritten note was taped gently to the side of the wooden box. He leaned closer and read the message. Thank you for starting this little library. I hope these books can help it grow. There was no name, just the message. Mr. Bennet looked at the stack again. There were at least 15 books. Children's stories, mystery novels, travel books, even a few poetry collections. He slowly began arranging them inside the shelf, but the tiny library was already reaching its limit. There simply was not enough space. Mr. Bennet stood there for a moment, thinking. Then he laughed quietly to himself. This little shelf might need a bigger friend, he murmured. Later that afternoon, Mr. Bennett walked to the local hardware store again. The young cashier from his last visit recognized him immediately. Building another tiny library? The cashier asked with a smile. Mr. Bennett chuckled. It seems the first one is already getting crowded. He bought more wood, more nails, and another can of paint. This time, he planned to build something slightly bigger, not too large. He still wanted the library to feel simple and welcoming. Back in his garage, he began working slowly and carefully. The rhythm of measuring, cutting, and hammering felt strangely comforting. It reminded him of preparing lessons years ago. Patient work, small steps, clear purpose. Outside, the neighborhood continued its quiet life. Children rode bikes, neighbors walked dogs, cars came and went. But something interesting is beginning to happen. More people were stopping by the tiny library each day. Some took books, some left books, but many simply paused for a moment to look. Sometimes strangers even spoke to each other while standing there. One afternoon, two neighbors who had lived on the same street for years discovered they both loved historical novels. And they stood near the shelf, discussing their favorite authors for nearly 20 minutes. Another evening, a father helped his daughter choose her first chapter book. She held it carefully, like a small treasure. These moments were quiet, but they were meaningful, and Mr. Bennett noticed them all. By Thursday, the new shelf was finished. It was about twice the size of the original one, still simple, still made of plain wood, but stronger and roomier. Mr. Bennett carried it outside and placed it beside the first shelf. Then he carefully moved the books into their new home. When he stepped back to look, he felt a quiet sense of pride. The tiny library had grown, not because he planned it, but because the neighborhood had helped it grow. That evening, something surprising happened. Emily appeared again. She walked toward the library with her younger brother beside her. The boy looked curious and excited. When they saw the new shelf, Emily gasped. "You made it bigger," Mr. Bennett smiled. "It looks like the books needed more space." Emily's brother immediately started looking through the new rows. "So many books," he said. Emily turned toward Mr. Bennett with shining eyes. "Can we help take care of it?" Mr. Bennett raised his eyebrows slightly. "What do you mean?" Emily thought for a moment. "We could help organize the books. And maybe clean the shelf sometimes. And make sure the books stay neat." Her brother nodded enthusiastically beside her. Mr. Bennett felt deeply touched by the offer. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," he said gently. From that day on, Emily and her brother became the library's first official helpers. Every few days they visited the shelf, they arranged the books, they wiped away dust, they even separated children's books from adult novels. Emily made small handwritten labels to help readers find what they liked. One label read, "Adventure Stories." Another said, "Funny Books," and another, "Books for Young Readers." Mr. Bennett watched all of this with quiet amazement. The library was no longer simply his project. It had become something shared, something alive, something growing. The changes continued the following weekend. On Saturday morning, a man in a blue work jacket knocked on Mr. Bennett's door. "Hello," the man said politely. "My name is David. I live down the block." He pointed toward the library. "My wife and I love what you've started." Mr. Bennett smiled. "That's kind of you to say." David scratched the back of his neck thoughtfully. "Well, I build things for a living," he explained. I was wondering if you'd like a small roof over the shelf. Mr. Bennet blinked in surprise. A roof? Just a little one, David said, to protect the books when it rains. Mr. Bennet laughed warmly. That sounds like a wonderful improvement. The next day, David returned with tools and wooden boards. Within a few hours, he built a small, slanted roof above the library. Now the books would stay dry during rainy days. When they finished, several neighbors gathered nearby to admire the improvement. Someone brought lemonade, someone else brought cookies. For a short while, the quiet street felt like a small celebration. Mr. Bennet stood among them, smiling softly. Only a few weeks earlier, the neighborhood had felt quiet and distant. Now people were talking, sharing, helping, all because of a simple wooden shelf filled with books. Later that evening, after everyone had returned home, Mr. Bennet stepped outside one more time. The streetlights glowed softly along the sidewalk. The library stood quietly under its new roof. Rows of books waited patiently for the next reader. Mr. Bennet placed his hand gently on the wooden shelf. He remembered the lonely mornings after retirement, the silent house, the empty feeling of not knowing what came next. But now things were different. Now each day held small surprises, new books, new readers, new conversations. He looked down the peaceful street and smiled. The tiny library had already changed the neighborhood, but Mr. Bennet still did not realize something important. The story of this little library was about to travel even farther, far beyond this quiet street, far beyond this neighborhood, because sometimes the smallest ideas can grow into something that reaches more people than we ever imagine. And the next chapter of this story was already quietly on its way. Several weeks passed after the tiny library received its small wooden roof. By now, the shelf had become something familiar to the neighborhood. People no longer walked past it with curiosity alone. Now they walked toward it with purpose. Children stopped after school. Parents paused during evening walks. Older neighbors sometimes sat on nearby steps while slowly flipping through the pages of a book. And the tiny library had quietly woven itself into the rhythm of the street. And Mr. Bennet noticed something else. People were no longer strangers to each other. One afternoon, he saw two mothers talking beside the shelf while their children compared adventure stories. Another evening, a teenager recommended a mystery novel to a younger boy who had never read one before. Small conversations, short moments, but they made the street feel warmer, friendlier, more alive. Mr. Bennet often sat on his porch watching these moments unfold. Sometimes he read a book. Sometimes he simply listened. The quiet laughter of children, the sound of pages turning, the gentle greetings between neighbors. It reminded him of his classroom years ago, not the lessons or the chalkboard, but the feeling of people learning and sharing together. And one bright Saturday morning, something unexpected happened. A woman with a camera walked slowly down the street. She stopped near the library and began taking photographs. She took pictures of the wooden shelves, the rows of books, the small flower pot beside them, and even the handwritten labels Emily had made. Mr. Bennet noticed her from his porch and walked over. "Good morning," he said politely. The woman smiled. "Good morning. Are you Mr. Bennet?" He looked slightly surprised. "Yes, I am. My name is Sarah," she explained. "I write stories for our local community newspaper." She gestured toward the tiny library. "I heard about this place from a friend." Mr. Bennet chuckled softly. "I didn't expect it to travel that far." Sarah laughed. "Well, good ideas tend to travel." She asked if she could ask him a few questions. Mr. Bennet agreed. They sat on the porch while she wrote notes in a small notebook. "Why did you start the library?" she asked. Mr. Bennet thought for a moment. Then he answered honestly. "I had too many books," he said with a gentle smile. "But I think the real reason was that I missed sharing stories with people." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And how does it feel now?" Mr. Bennet looked toward the shelf where two children were picking out books. "It feels like the neighborhood built something together." Sarah finished writing and closed her notebook. "I think people will love hearing about this." The following Wednesday morning, something surprising appeared on Mr. Bennet's front steps, a newspaper, folded carefully. He picked it up and opened it slowly. There, on the front page of the community section, was a photograph of the tiny library. The headline read, "A little library bringing big smiles to Maple Street." Below the headline was Sarah's article. She wrote about how the library began with one retired teacher and a shelf of old books. She described how neighbors had added their own stories to the collection. She even mentioned Emily and her brother organizing the books. By the end of the article, the tiny library sounded less like an object and more like a living part of the community. Mr. Bennet read the article twice. Then he placed the newspaper on the kitchen table and smiled quietly. Later that afternoon, something new began happening. Visitors arrived, not just neighbors. Night people from nearby streets came to see the little library they had read about. Some brought books to donate. Some simply stopped to look. One man drove across town after reading the article. He left a box of novels and said he loved the idea. A teacher from a nearby school visited with her students. They each left a book from their classroom collection. By the end of the week, the library shelves were full again. And then something even more interesting happened. A few houses down the street, Mr. Bennet noticed a small wooden box being installed near another sidewalk. Curious, he walked over. The neighbor smiled and explained. "You inspired us," the neighbor said. "We're starting another little library here." A few days later, another appeared on the next block, then another one near the small park. The idea was spreading. The neighborhood was slowly filling with tiny libraries, each one different, each one cared for by different neighbors, but all connected by the same simple idea: share a book, share a story, share a little kindness. One peaceful evening, Mr. Bennet sat on his porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed with soft colors of orange and pink. Emily and her brother were organizing books again. Two teenagers were laughing while arguing about which science fiction book was the best. A young mother was reading aloud to her child beside the shelf. Mr. Bennet leaned back in his chair and breathed slowly. The street felt warm and alive. For the first time in many years, Maple Street felt like more than just a row of houses. It felt like a community. Emily suddenly ran over to him. "Mister, I'm Bennet," she said excitedly. "You should see this." She handed him a book that someone had just placed on the shelf. Inside the cover was a handwritten message. It read, "For the little library that brought neighbors together." Mr. Bennet closed the book gently. He looked down the street again. Several small libraries now stood along the sidewalks like quiet guardians of stories, each one filled with books waiting to be discovered, each one inviting strangers to pause for a moment. He realized something important. When he first placed 10 books on that small wooden shelf, he thought he was only sharing stories. But in truth, something much bigger had happened. The library had opened conversations, it had created friendships, it had reminded people that small acts of kindness can grow in ways we never expect. "Mister?" Bennet smiled softly. Sometimes the biggest changes do not begin with big plans. Sometimes they begin with a simple shelf, a few old books, and a quiet hope that someone, somewhere, might open one and begin reading. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this gentle story for learning English, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And remember, learning English can be calm, slow, and meaningful when it comes through stories that touch the heart. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep sharing small kindness wherever you go.